April 9th, 1945. 1100 hours on a spring morning in Bavaria, where the smell of aviation fuel mixed with freshly turned earth and the sound of Allied bomber streams rumbled distant through broken clouds. Captain James Sullivan, United States Army Air Forces, felt his B-17 Flying Fortress shudder as the fourth engine died, hit by flak during the bomb run over Munich. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily, the three remaining engines insufficient to maintain the level flight with a full bomb load already released, and the crew preparing for emergency procedures. Below, through gaps in the cloud cover, the Bavarian countryside stretched in patches of forest and farmland, and among those patches, the geometric lines of a German airfield, runways, hangars, aircraft dispersed in revetments, the unmistakable infrastructure of military aviation. Sullivan made the calculation that every pilot dreads: they would not reach Allied lines. The B-17 was going down. He called the bailout order, watched his crew exit through hatches and bomb bay, counted to ensure all 9 men were clear, then followed them into the slipstream, the parachute opening with a shock that marked the transition from pilot to prisoner. He landed hard in a plowed field perhaps half a mile from the airfield perimeter. German soldiers reached him within minutes. Wehrmacht troops, not Luftwaffe ground crew, suggesting the airfield was under Army jurisdiction rather than Air Force control. They were professional, not hostile, searching him for weapons, collecting his dog tags, indicating with gestures and limited English that he should walk toward the airfield. Sullivan complied, hands raised, noting details with the practiced observation of a pilot who had been briefed extensively on what to look for if captured: aircraft types, unit markings, fuel storage locations, defensive positions. The airfield was small, perhaps a forward operating base or training facility rather than a major combat installation. He counted 6 Me-262 jet fighters in various states of readiness, the revolutionary aircraft that represented Germany's last hope for air superiority, along with several conventional fighters and what appeared to be a transport. The Germans escorted him across the field toward a low administrative building near the control tower. Other personnel emerged: officers, mechanics, a small crowd gathering to see the American bomber pilot who had fallen literally into their laps. Sullivan walked with his hands visible, making no threatening moves, maintaining the dignity that training had emphasized was essential for prisoners who wanted to survive interrogation and captivity. And then he saw it. Sitting on the tarmac perhaps 30 yards from the administrative building was a B-17, intact, bearing American markings, its bomb bay doors open and ground crew swarming over it with tools and equipment. A captured flying fortress, obviously being studied for intelligence purposes or perhaps being prepared for some covert operation. The sight was jarring. His own aircraft type, in enemy hands, a symbol of how the war's momentum could shift in unexpected ways. But what Sullivan noticed, what made his trained pilot's eye narrow with sudden understanding, was that the captured B-17's bomb bay was not empty. Visible in the shadows of the open bay were cylindrical shapes dark against the interior structure. Bombs, live ordnance. Why a captured aircraft would still carry bombs made no tactical sense unless the Germans had been in the process of examining American bomb-fusing mechanisms, unless they had not yet unloaded the weapons, unless, and this thought came with chilling clarity, the ordnance had been booby-trapped by the original crew before their capture. Sullivan's escort pushed him forward toward the administrative building, past the captured B-17. He calculated distances, trajectories, the blast radius of standard American bombs if they detonated. The Germans gathering to see him numbered perhaps 20, clustered near the building and the B-17. Other personnel worked across the airfield. He estimated total personnel at perhaps 70 to 80. A relatively small complement suggesting this was indeed a secondary facility rather than a major base. The Me-262 jets represented significant value, perhaps several $1 million of irreplaceable technology in an economy that could no longer replace losses. Their destruction would impact German jet operations in this sector, would remove aircraft that could threaten Allied bombers in the final weeks of the war. What happened in the next 51 seconds would be debated by military historians for decades, analyzed as either an act of calculated sabotage or an accident of war that achieved results no planned operation could have matched. Sullivan stopped walking. His escorts, surprised, turned to him with questions in German that he did not need to understand. He pointed at the captured B-17, gestured at the bomb bay, and spoke two words in English that he repeated in the limited German he had learned from intelligence briefings. Bomben. Danger. The nearest German officer looked confused, then irritated, assuming this was some attempt at resistance or delay. Sullivan pointed again, more emphatically, at the bombs visible in the B-17's bay. Booby trap, he said in English. Falle, using the German word for trap that he remembered from briefings. The German officer, a Luftwaffe Hauptmann, with the worn look of someone who had seen too much combat, followed Sullivan's gesture, looked at the B-17, then back at Sullivan. Understanding flickered across his face. Not certainty, but enough doubt to matter. He barked orders. Personnel began backing away from the captured bomber. The crowd that had gathered to see the American prisoner dispersed rapidly. Ground crew working on the B-17 climbed down from the aircraft and moved away. Sullivan, still flanked by his escorts, was pushed toward the administrative building, away from the bomber, as the Hauptmann shouted for the base commander and the ordnance disposal unit. 43 seconds had elapsed since Sullivan stopped walking. The explosion, when it came, was not massive, not the catastrophic detonation of a full bomb load, but it was sufficient. One bomb, perhaps triggered by movement of personnel working in the bay, perhaps wired to detonate on a timer, perhaps responding to tampering with fusing mechanisms, exploded with enough force to tear the B-17 apart. The blast wave knocked Sullivan and his escorts to the ground. Shrapnel tore through the administrative building, shattered windows, punctured aircraft parked nearby. Secondary explosions followed as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. The nearest Me-262, parked in a revetment perhaps 50 yards from the captured B-17, was engulfed in flames as burning fuel spread across the tarmac. Sullivan, ears ringing, pushed himself up to see chaos unfolding across the German airfield. Personnel ran in multiple directions, some toward the burning aircraft, some away, some simply running without clear purpose as training gave way to shock. The captured B-17 was gone, reduced to twisted metal and scattered debris. The administrative building was damaged but standing. Of the 6 Me-262 jets he had counted, one was burning. A second was damaged by shrapnel, and the others were intact, but threatened by spreading fires and secondary explosions as fuel storage tanks near the revetments began to burn. The German response, once the initial shock passed, was professional and disciplined. Fire crews emerged with equipment, began fighting the fuel fires, contained the spread to prevent additional aircraft losses. Medical personnel moved to assist the wounded. Sullivan saw at least 3 Germans on the ground, motionless, casualties of the explosion. Others limped or held injuries, blood visible on uniforms. The Hauptmann, who had ordered personnel away from the B-17, stood near the administrative building, staring at the wreckage, perhaps calculating how much worse the casualties would have been if the explosion had occurred with the crowd still gathered around the bomber, with ground crew still working in the bomb bay. Sullivan's escorts, recovering from the blast, pulled him to his feet roughly but without excessive violence. They seemed uncertain what to do with him. He was a prisoner who had just warned them about a booby-trapped aircraft, had potentially saved German lives, but was also an enemy whose comrades had created the trap in the first place. The contradiction was too complex for immediate resolution. They marched him away from the burning wreckage toward a hangar that appeared undamaged, and locked him in a small room that served as temporary confinement while the base dealt with the emergency. Sullivan sat on the floor of the locked room and listened to the sounds of crisis management outside, shouted orders, running footsteps, the roar of fire equipment, the secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off in burning aircraft. He calculated what he had witnessed. 1 Me-262 destroyed, 1 damaged, perhaps repairable. 4 intact, but potentially affected by the damage to base infrastructure. At least 3 German casualties, possibly more. The administrative building damaged. The captured B-17 eliminated as an intelligence source. And all of it triggered, at least in timing, by his warning. A warning that had saved German lives while simultaneously contributing to German losses. The historical context of what had occurred at that Bavarian airfield on April 9, 1945, was complex, and would only become clear with post-war analysis. The war in Europe had less than a month remaining. German forces were collapsing on all fronts, their industrial base destroyed, their fuel supplies exhausted, their manpower depleted. The Me-262 jet fighter represented the most advanced aircraft in operational service, a technological leap that could have changed the air war if introduced earlier in numbers that Germany could no longer produce. Each Me-262 lost was irreplaceable. Each pilot killed was a loss Germany could not absorb. The small airfield where Sullivan had been captured was part of the fragmenting infrastructure of a dying war machine, still functioning through discipline and habit, but without realistic hope of affecting the war's outcome. The Germans who had expected to interrogate an American prisoner and extract tactical intelligence instead found themselves dealing with the aftermath of an explosion that had killed their comrades and destroyed valuable equipment. Sullivan, who had expected to spend the remainder of the war as a POW, had instead become a figure of ambiguous status, neither entirely enemy nor entirely savior, his warning having prevented casualties while his nation's weapon had caused others. The emotional contrast between expectation and experience created a psychological dissonance that no training manual addressed adequately. After 3 hours, a German officer, an older man with staff insignia, likely brought from a higher headquarters to investigate, entered Sullivan's confinement room. He spoke English with a heavy accent but adequate clarity. "You warned about the bomb," he said. It was not a question. Sullivan nodded. "Why?" the officer asked. Sullivan considered the question carefully before answering. "Because people were going to die," he said. "German or American didn't matter in that moment. They were going to die, and I could prevent it." The German officer regarded him silently, then said, 10 men were near the aircraft when you gave warning. 3 are dead. 7 are alive. Without your warning, all 10 would be dead and perhaps 20 more." He paused. "You are still an enemy, but you acted with honor. That will be noted in my report." The transformation this incident represented was subtle, but philosophically significant. Sullivan's action, warning his captors about danger, violated no military regulation but contradicted the implicit expectation that enemies should be happy to see each other destroyed. His calculation had been instantaneous and moral rather than tactical. People were in immediate danger, he could warn them. Therefore, he should warn them. The German officer's response, acknowledging honor in an enemy's action, similarly transcended the dehumanization that sustained combat operations. Both men had momentarily set aside the frameworks that defined them as enemies and acted according to codes that predated national loyalties. The obligation to prevent unnecessary death. The recognition of courage regardless of uniform. The symbolic object that defined this incident was neither weapon nor tool, but something more abstract and more powerful. The warning itself, the spoken words, the pointing gesture, the communication across enemy lines that death was imminent and avoidable. Throughout the war, silence had been weaponized. Soldiers did not warn enemies, did not reveal dangers, maintained operational security even when doing so caused unnecessary casualties. Sullivan's warning broke that pattern, transformed information from a hoarded resource into a shared obligation, demonstrated that humanity could persist even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The warning represented the democratic value that individual human lives mattered more than tactical advantages, that morality could exist independent of military necessity, that the war would end, but the moral choices made during it would define those who survived. The German airfield fell silent after the fires were controlled and the casualties evacuated. Personnel returned to their duties with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned to compartmentalize trauma, to continue functioning because stopping meant confronting realities too large to process. The damaged Me-262 was stripped for parts. The destroyed jet was written off. The captured B-17's remains were cleared from the runway. Sullivan remained in confinement for 2 more days before being transferred to a POW processing center and eventually to a camp that would be liberated by advancing American forces 16 days later. He never learned the names of the 3 Germans killed in the explosion or the 7 who survived because of his warning. The German officer who acknowledged his honor did not appear again. In the decades following the war, Sullivan rarely spoke about the incident. When asked, he would note only that he had done what seemed right at the moment, that he would make the same choice again, that he could not have lived with himself if he had remained silent and watched people die from preventable causes. He did not claim heroism. He did not dwell on the moral complexity of warning enemies while his nation was still at war with theirs. He simply stated that some obligations transcended uniform and nationality, that recognizing shared humanity was not betrayal, but the foundation on which post-war peace would need to be built. The military analysis of the incident focused on the tactical implications: the destruction of irreplaceable Me-262s, the damage to German air infrastructure, the intelligence value lost when the captured B-17 was destroyed. Some analysts argued Sullivan should have remained silent, should have allowed maximum damage to enemy assets. Others noted that his warning had been humanitarian rather than tactical, that American military doctrine did not require prisoners to facilitate enemy casualties through inaction, that his choice aligned with the values the Allies claimed to be fighting for. The debate was never formally resolved, existing in the gray space where military necessity meets moral obligation. The transformation the incident represented extended beyond Sullivan's individual choice to encompass the larger question of how wars end and enemies become neighbors. Germany would be defeated militarily within weeks of the Airfield explosion. But the post-war reconstruction of Europe would require former enemies to coexist, to rebuild relationships, to find ways of acknowledging the humanity they had spent years trying to destroy in each other. Sullivan's warning, the act of protecting enemy lives at potential cost to his own nation's tactical position, modeled the kind of moral calculus that would be necessary for reconciliation. It demonstrated that seeing enemies as human beings rather than abstractions did not require abandoning national loyalty, but rather required recognizing that loyalty and humanity could coexist, that the codes governing warfare included obligations that transcended victory and defeat. The silence that fell over the German airfield after the explosion was temporary. Fires were extinguished. Operations resumed. The war continued for its final weeks. But beneath that resumed activity was a different silence, the silence of people who had witnessed something that complicated the narratives sustaining their ability to fight. The German personnel who had been saved by an American prisoner's warning could not easily maintain the dehumanization necessary for total war. The American prisoner who had warned his captors could not easily reconcile his action with the framework that defined Germans as enemies to be destroyed without moral complication. Both sides had experienced a moment when the war's logic failed, when individual choice superseded systematic enmity, when the human obligation to prevent death proved stronger than the military obligation to cause it. In the end, what occurred at that Bavarian airfield on April 9, 1945, was not strategically significant. The war would have ended on the same date whether those Me-262s had been destroyed or preserved, whether those German personnel had died or survived. But significance is not measured solely in strategic outcomes. The incident demonstrated that even in total war, individual moral choices retained meaning, that humanity persisted in circumstances designed to eliminate it, that the values democracies claim to fight for could be lived rather than merely proclaimed. Sullivan's warning, spoken in the 51 seconds between his capture and the explosion, echoed in the silence that followed. A silence not of death but of people recognizing that the enemy they had been trained to hate had just saved their lives, that the war's categories were insufficient for the reality they had experienced, that rebuilding would require remembering this moment when choice superseded doctrine and humanity superseded enmity. The symbolic warning that Sullivan had given, the words and gesture that transformed information into moral action, represented the advantage democratic systems possessed not through superior technology or numbers, but through the permission to act according to individual moral judgment, even when doing so complicated military objectives. Authoritarian systems demanded obedience that subordinated individual conscience to state objectives. Democratic systems, for all their inefficiencies and complications, allowed individuals to make choices that reflected values beyond victory, to act according to moral frameworks that would outlast any particular conflict. Sullivan's choice to warn his captors was only possible in a system that had trained him to value human life as an absolute rather than a variable dependent on nationality. that had taught him rules of warfare included protecting non-combatants and avoiding unnecessary casualties, even among enemies, that had given him the moral foundation to recognize that some obligations transcended tactical advantage. The silence that fell over the airfield after the explosion, after the fires were controlled and the casualties counted, was the silence of transformation, the moment when enemies recognized that the framework sustaining their enmity were insufficient for the complexity of human interaction. That peace would require more than military victory, that the choices made in the final days of war would shape the possibilities available in the first days of peace. Sullivan's warning, given without hesitation in the seconds available, demonstrated that those choices could honor both national loyalty and human obligation, that democratic values were not abstract ideals but practical guides for navigating the moral chaos of warfare. The 3 Germans who died in the explosion, and the 7 who survived because of his warning, represented the arithmetic of individual choice in a conflict defined by mass casualties, a reminder that even when strategic outcomes were predetermined, individual actions retained meaning, that moral choices mattered not because they changed the war's conclusion, but because they determined what kind of people would emerge from the war to build the peace that followed.